Hello, I'm so happy to be here virtually to share my new book with you all. Thank you to Dr. Myron as well as Elizabeth Cummings, who ran the planning for this program like a well oiled machine. So, I will introduce myself by saying that all of the research I do as a historian and a professor is connected to my family. Like most people who identify themselves as African American, I come from people who were enslaved for generations. But on my father's side, my ancestors were not owned by white people. They were owned by Native Americans. In the 1830s, they, along with their Chickasaw and Choctaw Indian owners, embarked on a journey that we know today as the Trail of Tears, making their way to Oklahoma, which was then known as Indian Territory. During the Civil War, their owners fought for the Confederacy, and when the Confederacy lost, the United States government forced my family's owners, along with other Native American slave owners, to free their slaves and provide them with land. And so, in about a minute, I've just reframed how most people think about slavery, Indian removal, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. All of these events that are so important to this country's history were different for my family because they lived within Indian nations, not within the United States. And retelling and reshaping these histories is the core of my book. I've been here all the while. Now, one of the key themes of my book is what it means that Native Americans adopted slavery in the first place, taking on ideas about race and Black inferiority that we usually only associate with white people. And another theme is how, after emancipation, some African Americans took on negative and harmful stereotypes about Native Americans as they migrated to the West. So, this evening, I'm going to give you an overview of this history and talk to you about how I think acknowledging some of the negative interactions between Black and Native people in our past is necessary for us to work together as allies today. So, let's start with how Native Americans began to own Black people as slaves. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, white American politicians and reformers encouraged Native Americans, particularly those in the East and Southeast, to adapt aspects of Euro American culture, such as language, clothing, and political structures, arguing that this would civilize them. This may be familiar to some of you. For example, Henry Knox, the Secretary of War under President George Washington, advocated what we call the civilization policy because he believed that if Indians were more like whites, they would be more willing to give up a majority of their land. Then, in his kind of ideal world, Indians would then use their reduced landholdings like white Americans, engaging in agriculture and private land use and disavowing their tradition of communal land ownership. As chattel slavery became increasingly integral to white American society, white Americans also encouraged Native people to become slaveholders because, of course, slaveholders were considered really the height of economic success. So within this period, all Indian tribes took on various facets of American culture that suited them and ignored those that didn't suit them. For example, Christian religion and American gender roles were two things that most people in the Chickasaw Nation, the nation in which several members owned members of my family, they didn't embrace those until arguably the early 20th century. And so Native people in this time period are picking and choosing what they're interested in and what they care about. But many of the wealthiest, most influential members of five Indian nations did begin to buy enslaved Black people like my family members. And these are these five tribes: the Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, Seminoles, and Cherokees. And you've probably heard of these tribes. They've especially been in the news lately because of their COVID-19 vaccination efforts. And so, in addition to slavery, these five tribes also do things like create newspapers in the model of European and American newspapers, create a tripartite government structure similar to that of the United States, although these are two things that are working really alongside each other, native modes of governance as well as American modes of governance. And for this reason, because these five tribes choose to assimilate in various ways, white Americans began calling them five civilized tribes, which Americans now shorten to five tribes because, of course, five civilized tribes is very problematic. Now, along with the slave owning development in these tribes comes with the idea that people of African descent are inferior. And while, just like in the United States, the majority of people in these nations didn't own slaves, the Indian elites who did created a culture and an economy that highly valued and regulated slavery and the rights of slave owners. Then, in the 1830s, an event, or really a process, changed the life of all of these slaveholding tribes, as well as the Black people who lived among them, and that's Indian removal. And so, since contact, the British had struggled to really reconcile the fact that they wanted Native American land with the reality that they didn't have the manpower or the resources to just take it by force. And so they made treaties and agreements with Native people for parcels of land or for control of various regions. Now, in the colonial period, Native peoples and Europeans negotiated this settlement on relatively equal grounds, often with Native people actually having more power and influence in these relationships, but they were using both treaties and political measures as well as war and violence. But after the Revolutionary War, coercive white encroachment on Native Americans' land steadily increased as settlers sought resources and homesteads and moved farther west. As plantation style slavery spread through the 19th century, the Five Tribes found their lush, agriculturally rich southeastern homes under attack. White settlers began illegally squatting on their land, and state governments followed their lead by sanctioning this trespassing and trying to extend their state laws over Native Americans and their lands. And so this was all part of an effort to either force Indians to move west of the Mississippi River, as Americans have been trying to get them to do since really the beginning of the country, or to force them to submit and just allow whites to take their land. Now, Native American people fought against this, sometimes militarily through war or conflict, but also through law, which is what they were told to do, which is what they were told civilized people did, use the law. But all of these were ultimately unsuccessful for the majority of Native people, especially in these five tribes. And so, as you probably know, this is going on through the 1820s, but in 1830, the federal government, with President Andrew Jackson at its head, shows its support for what these white settlers and white Southerners are doing by advocating for and signing the Indian Removal Act. Now, for good reason, Indian removal is considered for many tribes to be really a foundational journey, a journey that solidified their resilience as a people. But what I want you to take from this talk is that Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, did that same thing for many of the enslaved people who endured alongside their owners in the five tribes. And so those people of African descent remembered removal as really a trauma that solidified their membership in these tribes and their shared history with these tribes. So there are really two different ways that Black and Native history intersect in what I've kind of just given you, and that's first, that Indian removal is necessary for the expansion of plantation slavery, and second, that Indian removal itself involved people of African descent. Now, as for these tribes rebuilding after removal, many historians would argue that actually they rebuild better than before. And so they, of course, create government buildings, homes, plantations, and there are many people who are very economically successful once they make it to, again, what is then known as Indian territory. But about 30 years pass, and the United States is increasingly divided over slavery. Soon we have the Civil War. And as nations where important and influential families owned enslaved Black women and men, the five tribes were very interested in these discussions occurring in the United States about Black humanity, Black rights, the Civil War, the expansion of slavery, all these things that we think about as key to this country were also very important in the five tribes. In some tribes, especially the Cherokee and Creek nations, there were large factional disputes over the institution of slavery and over joining in the war. Now, as the Confederacy is kind of building alliances, in an effort to recruit them, the Confederacy talks to the five tribes using an agent who was very familiar with members of these tribes, and they really tell them what they want to hear, and they argue that they will give them what the United States, what the Union, has not been giving them. And so they say they would allow them to have more of a say in governmental affairs. They would allow them to have congressional representation. They would allow them to keep their land in Indian territory forever without white settlement. They would be more reliable at paying them their money for their homelands that they had sold to the US government. And most importantly, for some of these elites, they would allow them to keep slavery, while the Union, after 1863, would, of course, have not. Now, would the Confederacy actually have kept these promises? Probably not. After all, the Confederacy was partially composed of the states that had just forced the five tribes out of their homelands around 30 years earlier. But still, these entreaties were enticing to members of the five tribes. So you have a shared ideology around slavery that some members of the five tribes have and think is very important. But then you also have geography. And so the Indian Territory, especially where these five tribes are located, is very close to, Texas, Arkansas, many of these kind of Confederate strongholds in the more western part of the country at this time. So it's important that they have some sort of protection. And so there are practical aspects of these alliances as well as kind of sentiment, shared sentiment around slavery. And so as we go into the war, all of the five tribes are split. Members of all of these tribes fight for the Union, fight for the Confederacy, and others are refugees who actually leave Indian Territory hoping to avoid fighting or having to choose battles. Around 14 battles are fought in and around Indian Territory. Just like in the United States, a number of enslaved Black men leave to fight for the Union or stay and are forced to work for their Confederate owners, doing physical labor predominantly. And when the war is over, the United States ignores the fact that some tribal members had fought for the Union. They ignore the fact that they had not sent the five tribes any protection. They wouldn't even give them extra munitions. Instead, the United States uses the fact that some tribal members had fought for the Confederacy against them. And so the US points to the five tribes' affiliations with the Confederacy as behavior supposedly deserving of punishment, deserving of distrust. And they claim that because they made an alliance and treaties with the Confederacy, that the United States no longer has valid treaties with them. And so they threaten to withhold money that they desperately need after a war unless they sign new treaties. And they do, because they've been coerced into it. And so these treaties are called the Treaties of 1866. They serve as the five tribes' official surrender as well as their reconstruction documents. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So one of the most extreme items in these treaties is the cession of land. So the five tribes are forced to give up a majority of the land that they had really just moved on only around 30 years earlier. The other three big items in these treaties relevant to our discussion today were that the five tribes had to emancipate the enslaved people in their nations, they had to adopt them as citizens, and they had to give them land. And the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations had to give them specifically 40 acres of land. Now, if you're at all familiar with Reconstruction or really Black history in general, then you know how significant that 40 acres is, because African Americans in the US fought for that and they didn't get it. And so this is the United States coming into another nation, Indian nations, that are supposed to have the right to create their own laws, run their own nation, be completely sovereign in just about every other way. And the US is saying, we're going to force you to free enslaved people, something we ourselves cannot do without a war. We're going to force you to adopt these people as citizens and give them all the accompanying rights of citizenship, something we ourselves in 1866 have not yet done. And we're going to force you to give them land. Now, was this right? Legally, no. Now, the Cherokee Nation had ordered emancipation in 1863, so they were the only one of the five tribes who decided to do this without direct coercion. But all the others, the Creeks, the Seminoles, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, would they have ever emancipated enslaved people without American intervention? We don't know. After emancipation, would they have given their former slaves rights and citizenship? Probably not. Would they have given them land? Probably not. But this freedom, these rights, and especially this land put the former slaves of the five tribes on a different plane than African Americans in the United States. It gave them different opportunities. And these opportunities are why so many Black people from the US flocked there after emancipation. It's why Oklahoma has so many Black towns and why it had Black Wall Street, which, of course, the anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre just passed. More people are far more aware of Black Wall Street and its existence. And so this moment in Reconstruction Indian Territory history is really one of those interesting historical moments where my identity as both a historian and a descendant of former slaves of Chickasaws and Choctaws, which I call freed people, comes into play because I have to recognize something as legally wrong as US intervention in a foreign nation, or as Indian nations were known after the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia Supreme Court case, domestic dependent nations. But I also have to recognize that people like my family might never have been freed if not for these technically legally unjust actions on the part of the United States. Now, I'm going to use that term for former slaves again and again, probably in this presentation, so I just wanted to run over those real quick. So Indian freed people is a general term that I use in my work to refer to any former slave of any of the 5 tribes. And of course, more specifically, Chickasaw freed people, Chickasaw freed women, and freed men refer to specifically the former slaves of Chickasaw Indians. And so the reason that the land designated for Indian freed people in these treaties, the treaties of 1866, is different and is historically significant is because this was Black land receipt through American governmental action. Congressional Republicans had not been able to agree on giving African Americans in the United States land. It was frankly impossible for the majority of Republicans who were moderates to imagine taking land from a white person and giving it to a Black person. As I'm sure you know, property ownership was and continues to be one of the most revered American values. But Republicans such as the Secretary of the Interior and Commissioner of Indian Affairs at the time could imagine giving Indian land to people of African descent. Because in these men's opinion, the 5 tribes didn't value land because they didn't value private land ownership in the same way that white Americans did. And so they saw Indians' use of land as uncivilized. They saw them as not properly utilizing their land. Therefore, to them, giving Indian land away to people of African descent fulfilled its kind of lofty, idealistic Republican goal of Black land ownership while still allowing whites in the United States to maintain their land. And so here is the United States using this idea of Indian savagery against the 5 tribes, who, as I told you earlier, used to be considered civilized, different from other Native people. But now that that is no longer politically useful, the 5 tribes are once again uncivilized. And this change allows Black people to take ownership of land in Indian territory. And Indian free people of the 5 tribes played into this. So I want to show you a Chickasaw freedman named Blaine Holman and the way he talked about his former owners. So he says, at that time, the Indians did not have anything but small farms. And of course, the freedmen were reared among them, so they didn't work like they should, but just raised enough corn to make their bread. And so this may seem, maybe this isn't that bad, but the language that he uses, they didn't work like they should. So he's using the idea of Americanness as being enterprising, as creating wealth. But in his opinion, Native Americans were only looking to survive. And so really he's saying that with American tutelage, Indian free people were capable of working harder the way they should if they were only given the model and the opportunity. And so this is strategic language use. Indian freed people were very aware that it was the United States that had negotiated for their freedom and for their land ownership, not their native former slave owners. And so some of them aligned themselves with white Americans and their definitions of civilization and productivity. And as more Black people look to move west, we see some of them also using these ideas about Native American laziness or lack of productivity or civilization. In fact, one of the most famous African American leaders of the 19th century and really of all time, Frederick Douglass, gave several speeches where he spoke about how African Americans might find land and peace in the West and how the United States should support this endeavor financially. But to support this appeal, Douglass denigrated Native Americans. So in his speech to the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1869, Douglass said this: "The Negro is more like the white man than the Indian in his tastes and tendencies and disposition to accept civilization. The Indian rejects our civilization. It is not so with the Negro. He loves you and remains with you under all circumstances in slavery and in freedom." Now here we can see a clear dichotomy being made between African Americans and white Americans on one hand, and Native Americans on the other hand. And of course, Native Americans are on the bad side, the uncivilized side. Now he's really joining African Americans' goals and behavior with white people's by using our civilization. In another earlier speech titled Land for the Landless, Douglass said this: "The peopling of the national domain with an enterprising, intelligent, and hardy race of immigrants, transforming the savage wilderness into flourishing civilized communities, multiplying new states and adding immensely to the wealth and productive industry of the nation, would extend the area of freedom and would increase the political power of the North and West, the power of the people, would dangerously menace the perpetuity of the institution of slavery and the democratic slaveholding aristocracy built upon it. And so these sound like good things, right? Of course, we want to increase freedom. We want to limit the power of the democratic slaveholding aristocracy. But to say these things, what is Douglas doing? Again, he's putting down Native people who, in his words here, have not utilized the West. And so Douglas, of course, is an educated man. He is familiar with Native Americans and with Native reformers. He knew this land was not free and that it had not always been part of the national domain, but rather it had been taken from Indian hands. Douglas also knew that its swell of American immigration to the region would change and worsen circumstances for Native people. Yet, here he is using the language of savagery and civilization to juxtapose what the region was allegedly like in Indian hands, bad, and what it might be like after an interracial American immigration of whites and blacks, good. Now, while Douglas's two speeches are given around 4 years apart, I think they represent a sustained belief on the part of one of our most famous Black radicals that African Americans deserve to share in the settler colonial spoils of the Native West. And so, what my book's argument really boils down to is that my identity in these kind of two different worlds, that of Indian freed people and African Americans in the United States, allowed me to see the past these categories that we traditionally put Native and Black people into. And so we might see them as victims or as people who had horrific events occur in their lives and fought back against them and were resilient. And so we celebrate their triumphs. And of course, I understand why. But when we're confronted with the complexities of their actions and the ways in which their words affected others, are we willing to see Black and Native people in a different way? Can we accept the fact that people who suffered so much from settler colonialism as dispossessed peoples, as forced laborers, as forced reproducers of mixed race children, can we accept that these same people could also act in a capacity that served the colonial state at times? They're difficult questions, but I do look forward to hearing your thoughts about them. Thank you.